Dominant victory for Mercedes then in the opening Grand Prix of the 2019 Formula 1 season. But it was only one of the cars that cleared off into the distance because the other one was stuck battling a problem as it emerged after the race. Valtteri Bottas won at an absolute canter. Lewis Hamilton had a bit of a fight on his hands to keep second place, and he was struggling for pace during the Grand Prix and really wondering what was going on, why his teammate was pulling so far away. Mercedes discovered after the race that Hamilton had floor damage, and I've got Jake Boxall-Legge, our technical expert, and Ben Anderson from F1 Racing to discuss Mercedes' weekend. And it's Hamilton's floor damage where we're going to start. So JBL, I'll come to you. Once we found out what was wrong, we went looking for where the piece was maybe missing from, and we found out exactly where it was on the car. And we've got this 3D animation from our visual effects team where we can zoom right in on the piece that had fallen off and try and explain the functions, really. So how much of a damaging part would this have been to Hamilton's race to have lost a piece of the floor?
So what it was this corner of the floor that was missing. We don't know how it happened. There was just a point in the race where Lewis Hamilton suddenly didn't have it anymore. And it only looks like a really small part. It's just a very, very small corner, but it's going to have quite a large effect on everything around this area of the car. So what these slots do is just essentially try and seal the floor a little bit, and the diffuser further upstream as well, because when this tyre rotates, it creates something what's called Tyre Squirt. And so essentially the centre portion of the tyre just chucks a load of turbulent air into the diffuser. And this is to mitigate that, try and reduce the overall wake that it produces, try and reduce that amount of squirt. And so by having this slot here and up to here as well, you can sort of channel air a little bit around there and just sort of try and keep diffuser away from squirt, essentially. But without that, then there's going to be a point where when the wheel is rotating, there is just that big jet of air that's just thrown into the diffuser, and then the rear end just isn't working quite as well anymore because you've still got all of that turbulent air underneath, stopping the expansion of the air from underneath the car through the diffuser, and then you're just not producing as much rear end downforce. So it's going to have quite a strong effect on Hamilton's car. He was able to manage it, he was able to do everything he could, but he was never realistically in contention for the lead with that amount of a problem.
It's amazing how sensitive modern Formula 1 cars are. A tiny piece of the floor, in conjunction with all these other thousands of pieces, you lose it and your race is effectively over. Hamilton was never in the game. It all felt very 2016, didn't it? Mercedes dominating at the front, no one else in the picture. Hamilton expected to win from pole, but his revitalised teammate nails the start and disappears into the distance. And very frustrating for Hamilton too, not to have the chance to come back at Bottas. Normally you'd expect with a healthy car, I think that he said he felt a change in the car's behaviour. So it's a long way to go with a damaged car. He never really had a chance to come back and make a race of it, which was a shame.
You mentioned Bottas there, and a little nod to Nico Rosberg's kind of 2015 to 16 rejuvenation that resulted in a championship. Bottas is obviously bouncing back from what turned out to be a bad 2018 in the end. He didn't win a race, and it just felt that by the end of the season he just needed to get away. I think the word he used was disappear in Abu Dhabi, wasn't it? But did it perhaps tell us something about Bottas and his mindset, that even once it became apparent, as you mentioned there, Ben, Hamilton wasn't in the race, Bottas could have kind of just managed things from there and maybe maintained a 6 to 10 second lead, but he cleared off almost to the tune of half a minute. Is that Bottas trying to make a massive statement at the first race of the year?
It certainly looks like that. Well, he did make a massive statement at the end of the race, didn't he? Telling
you can't repeat
persons
that on
unknown
this video.
to go screw themselves. I've slightly edited his comments there. Maybe we count among those people having criticised Bottas at the end of last season. I mean, it's fair to say that the last 2 years, his 2 years so far at Mercedes, they have tailed off badly. That's a pattern. It's not a one-off. And he's at least come out fighting at the start of this season, which you want to see. But he's been strong each of the last 2 seasons at the start, never quite so successful in the first race. It certainly will do a lot for his confidence. He was able to win so comfortably. He mentioned that he's come into this season with a slightly different mindset, not worrying so much about things coming into the race, trying to clear his mind. And he certainly drove like a guy unshackled, shall we say. But it's difficult to get a fair read on Bottas' true performance when Hamilton was so hamstrung by the floor problem on his car.
And I think with this phenomenal 3D model of the entire Mercedes that we've got, it'd be wrong to just focus on this part of the floor. So the great thing about these models that our guys make, JBL, is that it gives us different angles to look at some of the key parts of the car. You know, we always see the barge boards, for example, from the side-on image from the TV cameras or wherever Giorgio Piolo can get his lens and as close as he can get. But this enables us to twist and turn the car however we like and really give a totally different visual perspective on some key parts of an F1 car. Mercedes, as we said, utterly dominant last weekend. So what are the key bits that you think we should take a much closer look at now we have the chance?
I think we want to first have a look at something that we don't really get an angle of, generally speaking. So yeah, what we've got this wonderful image of the barge boards on this year's Mercedes. So you can really see the line of fire that the airflow has to take. You've got the bottom suspension wishbone here, and you've got this leading edge here of all these little short chord strakes and little vertical pieces as well. And so that's just grabbing airflow from the front end of the car. It's sort of led on by the front wing, what we call the Y250 vortex, which is the vortex produced by the inboard section of the front wing. So that has a massive effect on this part, and also the little turning vanes that you get underneath the chassis as well. And so it's trying to sort of pick that up and then turn that into something that's going to come further outboard and be managed by this main panel of the barge board here. The idea is to bring flow outboard. This tyre is creating a massive amount of turbulence here, and you kind of want to keep that away from all of the useful components here. You've got these pieces here that deal with that in a straight line, but then we're talking about, it's quite a three-dimensional thing. So obviously this tyre turns of varying degrees of rates, and so this has to work in a different way. So you've got to create a barge board package that works for all of these different angles of steering. So when the angle is inclined inwards, for example, it's still kicking up a lot of wake as well. So these particular pieces help to deal with that, turn it up, bring it using this barge board to bring it outwards, but does it in varying different degrees. These top flaps here, these have been extended on this particular barge board compared to what we saw in winter testing. You're going to get a little vortex that just emanates downwards, and then that can just be fired straight under the side pod undercut. And then when you've got the floor towards the end, you're creating a little bit more of a pressure difference over the top. So the underneath is working a little bit harder. So that creates a little bit more rear end downforce as well. And then there's this is quite new for this round in Australia. These halo winglets here, you've seen a few teams run them, but Mercedes tried them out in winter testing, sort of on and off, and thought, okay, we'll go with them. It's not something we usually ever talk about a lot because we don't really talk about the halo so much because we don't really notice it now. But these winglets do have their purpose. It's not a downforce producing element at all. If you look at the wing profile, you'll see that it's downward inclined, so it's going to create a very, very tiny amount of lift. But the idea is to bring the flow that passes over the top and send it downwards almost, because the direct wake of this halo enters the airbox inlet, and then that's going to have an effect on cooling because you've got this turbulent air that's going to essentially ruin the efficiency of the inlet. You're not getting the right mass flow rate of airflow into the engine and into the cooling for other associated components. So this sort of takes airflow down, and then that pens the wake in a little bit. So then you're getting a nice supply of clean airflow to the airbox inlet to deliver the flow pattern that you need it to. And then you've got the tips here. They've sort of been clipped off a little bit, but they're still going to create little vortices, and so the halo is shaped in order to just sort of keep them essentially on a sort of certain path rather than interfere other components, because that's sort of, it's a byproduct of every kind of wing really. It's always going to produce some kind of tip vortex, so the best thing to do is try and make it as small as possible. Obviously if you need it for something, then it can be in whatever shape you need it to. So yeah, that's the kind of thinking with the halo shape here.
Now, Mercedes didn't bring much in the way of upgrades to Australia. We saw obviously the huge upgrade package for the second pre-season test. But we did spot one tiny detail, or at least it's tiny to someone like me, at the rear of the car. Now, what's going on here and what was new and why would they be doing it?
Okay, so this is the DRS actuator housing here. And this is the little hinge here. So when the DRS is activated, this pulls inwards and lifts the flap up. Now for this year, DRS opens up by 20 millimetres more, so that's quite a few newtons of drag that it loses when it's activated. And you want to try and recover every little bit of that, because every single tiny bit of drag, that can be the difference between what is an overtake and what isn't. So everybody's shaping their actuator housings to try and produce as little drag as possible. It's never really been too much of an area that people have looked into too much, but Mercedes has come up with something really interesting. And it's just this serrated edge. It looks like the mouth of some kind of sea creature or something like that. And the idea is just this is always going to shed some kind of wake, no matter how small. And having these serrated edges kind of stops that in its tracks almost. It's still going to produce some kind of wake, but it tidies it up a bit more. It cleans it up a little bit more. So when you look at something like a serrated gurney flap or something like that, it's producing a little bit more downforce at the expense of wake shed, and you're trying to mitigate that. And this is the same principle. It's not producing downforce, but you've got all of these vortical structures that it's just essentially stopping from creating strange pressure gradients on top of the wing, and when the wing opens up it's not creating this massive weird airflow that's just reducing that drag that this is trying to reduce. So it's a tiny little detail and it's not going to have a massive effect on stuff, but it's interesting nonetheless, and it's certainly an area that you have to look at every single little detail, don't you? And it's certainly another one of these areas you have to look at.